Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and we've now reached the 31st of August 1651. So hopefully you've been following our road to the Battle of Worcester that was eventually fought on the 3rd of September, and like I said, we're up to the 31st of August, so the battle is literally just round the corner. So just to update you, what was going on 369 years ago today? Well, very simply, the city was still being bombarded by Parliament guns on all the high grounds. So if you think of Rainbow Hill, Albury Hill, and also across at Perry Wood, for example, they were firing. It wasn't a 24-hour, 7 days a week bombardment, but they were being fired on a regular basis, and not just in the hours of daylight. They would have been dropping the odd cannonball into the city even late at night as well. And remember, the two reasons for this is one, to gauge where the enemy have put their guns, and the second thing, to actually put fear into the royalists in the middle of the city. So to say, this is the firepower that we've got on the high ground, and we will wipe you out come the day of the great battle. The interesting thing is, Parliament had enough gunpowder and shot to continue to bombard Worcester, even in the run-up to the battle, and also during the battle. The supply routes for the Parliament army were actually very, very good. Saying that, tents did not arrive, because we do actually know that Cromwell had arranged tents to be sent for the new model army, and they didn't arrive. So interestingly, most of the soldiers were sleeping outside, which at the moment it's not too bad, but obviously as the autumnal weather comes in, it will actually get pretty cold at night time. I don't know if you've noticed how autumnal it's starting to feel outside at the moment. But the interesting thing is, the royalists, they were returning fire, which was a mistake really, because it was showing where the guns were. And the other problem is, they didn't have a supply train. So very simply, every time they returned fire with its shot and gunpowder, they were actually using very valuable ammunition as such that they are going to need for the battle. So it's not looking good, shall we say. But the 31st of August 1651 is important because famously, and we don't know how they did this, even now I'm racking my brains to how it was done, but interestingly, on this day's date, 369 years ago, the Earl of Derby arrived at Worcester. Now, the interesting thing is, Worcester is pretty much surrounded, but the Earl of Derby and the only survivors from the fight in Wigan Lane has turned up. And the weird thing is, there is only 30 of them. So famously today, Charles was in the city centre, and he would have found turning up in the city 30 very wounded cavalry. And at the lead was a wounded Earl of Derby, the man that had come from the Isle of Man, who had promised Charles that he would bring reinforcements with him. He said he would land in Lancashire, raise the Catholics in Lancashire, then move all the way down through the country, raising up the Englishmen basically. And as well as being 12,000 Scottish soldiers in Worcester, he was promising to bring maybe even 10,000 English royalists to Worcester. But unfortunately, there are 12,000 Scots in Worcester, and there are now 30 cavalry that the Earl of Derby has brought in. So it's not looking good. So if we take a look at the royalists, there's a lot of problems within that army really, all before that fateful date on the 3rd of September. So we've got vast amounts of desertion. There was a lot of people disappearing back up north. That was getting harder to do at this point because, like I said, Worcester was being encircled. The city was very hostile to the Scots. The whole of England was hostile to the Scots. This was a Scottish army, technically an invading army. So obviously Worcester people, like many people in England, didn't see Charles as a leader of royalist men. He was seen as a man that has started a war again and brought Scotsmen, foreign troops, into England. It's interesting because a lot of Worcester people cursed, it was described at the time in the accounts, cursed the Cavaliers in Worcester. And the weird thing is, Worcester is meant to be the faithful city. And as I keep emphasising, there is nothing faithful about Worcester whatsoever. We've also had 2 failed musters on Pitchcroft Racecourse. Obviously, no one wants to join this army, this rebel army that's going to be annihilated come the day of the battle. There was also several attacks led out of the city. They were trying to move the New Model Army, the parliamentarians, from all this high ground around the city. They failed. Famously, Major Knox was killed. Famously, he leapt over a hedge on his horse and lost his life, as I said with the quote, lost it in a vapour. The Hamilton's force as well that went up into Perrywood, they were also beaten back. So they're failing to shift the parliamentarians, and they're not at strength yet. They're just small units on the high ground. We've also got failed English recruitment. As I said, the Earl of Derby was supposed to raise England for Charles, and that's failed. There are arguments within the army. So remember, Leslie doesn't like Hamilton. They're not talking. They're shouting at each other. There's a couple of Englishmen that thinks they should be commanding the army now it's in England. They're tired and footsore, but please don't concentrate on that fact. You have to remember a lot of the parliamentarians were as well. If you think of the militias, some of them had come from Essex and Surrey. They had marched a very, very long way as well. And famously, Cromwell's New Model Army had left Scotland, left Perth and left the area just outside Edinburgh and marched down 300 miles in 3 weeks also. So they're also footsore and tired. And remember, the nobility within the Royalist army had massive doubts that it was actually going to be a successful campaign. There was people in Scotland, even 369 years ago, that were actually saying this is a doomed campaign. Charles is going to lose the battle when it is fought. Now, we've been talking about the Battle of Worcester. We've been talking about the Civil War for a very, very long time, not just in these videos, but we've been doing it way back into the 1990s, for example. I remember talking about the Civil War in 1992 during the 350th commemorations of the Battle of Powick. So we know the Civil War quite well, but the biggest thing is that we use a lot of sources and a lot of very good books. So we thought, as well as updating you of what was happening on the 31st of August 1651, we thought we would actually show you a few of the books that I would recommend. Now, if you're looking at the Civil War in Worcester, generally, there are several publications that you can look at. Some of them are primary sources. So we've got a book here, a booklet in fact. I don't know if it's still available. And it was produced by Malcolm Atkin, who was the County Archaeological Officer for several years. And this is the Civil War garrison of Worcester. And it actually covers the entire Civil War. So it covers 1642 all the way up to post-Civil War with the restoration of 1660. And it really talks about the men from Worcester. And I must say, there is nothing in there that will indicate Worcester is a faithful city, because it mentions garrisons, troops coming in. But when you look at Worcester folk, they are probably siding with Parliament, and they name quite a few people in there that were parliamentarians in the city of Worcester. We've then got the Chamber Order Book for Worcester. Now, this was produced quite some time ago now, and it's obviously a reprint, and it's a reprint of an original, and it was printed by the Worcestershire Historical Society, a reprint from that really. And the Chamber Order Book is the minute books from council meetings basically, and this covers 1602 and it goes on to, unfortunately, to the year 1650. So it ends just before the Battle of Worcester. But it's absolutely fantastic because you get the knowledge of the day-to-day life of Worcester and all the things that what we would now call the council were concerned with, including things like plague and the removal of rubbish in the streets, for example. But it's quite nice. It's a bit of social history that runs alongside the Civil War. And then there's a number of diaries and letters, and some of these have been put together in books. One of my favourites that I always highly recommend, which was actually reprinted by the Historical Society about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, was the Diary and Papers of Henry Townsend. And I've got a copy here, and it's a fantastic book because obviously it is diary accounts and letters, even personal accounts of Henry Townsend, and that covers the period 1640 to 1663. So it covers the Civil War, but also the run-up, and it's quite interesting to read about the run-up, including the sieges. A very, very good account of the sieges, to be fair, and also what happened after the Battle of Worcester. So there's a few books to look out for if you can get a chance to go to the library, or even purchase them, which I would highly recommend. If you've got an interest in the Civil War or even in the Battle of Worcester, then please get those books, because they're ideal to keep popping into, flicking through, or reading again and again and again. When we look at Worcestershire generally in the Civil War, some books that I would highly recommend is Worcestershire Under Arms, which is actually a more detailed version of the Worcester garrison that Malcolm Atkin wrote. So this was wrote by Malcolm Atkin, and it covers an English county during the Civil Wars, and it talks about raising troops, the militias and that sort of thing. And once again, Malcolm shares my enthusiasm with this. It once again shows that Worcester and Worcestershire is not quite as clean cut as we think. It is not quite the faithful city that we know and like to shout about as such, really. Then there's the fantastic book The Civil War in Worcestershire, which is also by Malcolm Atkin, which covers the entire Civil War, and it covers social history as well as military history. And in a way, that was written by Malcolm Atkin with the knowledge of an earlier book. And this is a book that I've mentioned before, and this is the Willis Bunn book, The Civil War in Worcestershire and the Scotch Invasion. And I like that title because it's showing that this is not quite a royalist army. This is a Scottish invasion that's landed up at Worcester on their way to London. They've been surrounded, they've been cut off, and they are going to have to fight. Now, if you want a look at general history of the English Civil War, there is a great many books on the Civil War. One I would highly recommend, if you can get hold of any copies, and luckily I've got every volume, is the very good book Clarendon, which is the history of the rebellion, the history of the Civil War, really, and it's very, very good. Mine was gifted to me, and they are leather bound. Absolutely fantastic books, really. But if you want something on the Battle of Worcester, because remember that's what we are commemorating in these videos, then I would recommend the following. There's the fantastic, which is probably one of my first books on the Battle of Worcester. This is British Battlefield series, and this one was wrote by Dr. Richard Holmes, the great military historian who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. That was probably my first book on the Battle of Worcester. He did, and the British Battlefield series did, a whole host of different ones that I've seen, but that's the Worcester campaign. There's a bit of information in there now that we know is incorrect, but that's really down to the fact that that's an old book, and we've got more up-to-date knowledge as we as we research more and more things become available. We've also got a small little booklet called The Battle of Worcester 1651, and this was when in America they had a recreation of the Battle of Worcester, and I'm just trying to think what year it was, but I remember we had a whole host of people come to Worcester, and I took them round. This was when I was working at the commandery, and I took them all around and met the man that was going to play King Charles II, who was an American, obviously, and also met a man that was also going to play the Duke of Hamilton. And I was explaining Worcester to them because they were recreating parts of Worcester in America for the big reenactment, and this was actually part of the programme that Malcolm Atkin wrote for them. So it's a brief overview of the battle. But the two chunkier books that take you through the Civil War briefly and then in detail of the Battle of Worcester are the two books by Malcolm Atkin. We have Worcester 1651, And the other one, which is probably my favourite one of the lot, Cromwell's Crowning Mercy, the Battle of Worcester, 1651. And like I said, these are available at good bookshops. I know Worcester Tourist Information Centre at the Guildhall also sell these books, so if you get a chance, go in there, get yourself a copy. Or if you don't want to spend money on a book, remember you can make use of the library service and look them up. They are really good books and I would highly recommend them. And if you've got an interest in the Civil War, this is enthused you to look at the Battle of Worcester in particular, please get out and get them. Anyway, on that note, remember the 31st of August is the day when Charles realises he doesn't really stand a chance, to be fair. The Earl of Derby's turned up with just 30 wounded cavalry, even though he promised the world, basically. And Charles is probably sat now in what is now the King Charles pub, head in his hands, and he can't believe the disaster that's unravelling before him. And remember, the battle hasn't been fought yet. That is still to take place, and that comes on the 3rd of September. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and remember, subscribe, because on the 3rd of September we're going to throw lots of videos at you looking at the entire battle filmed from where those events took place. Anyway, on that note, stay safe. See you soon.